welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook. If this is your first time listening to Harmonious World, then you should know that it gives me an opportunity to chat with musicians, and the title comes from a Quincy Jones quote: "Imagine what a harmonious world it would be if everyone shared a little of what they are good at." And heaven knows we need everyone to share what they're good at right now. And we need the world to be a little more harmonious. I'm delighted for this episode to be joined by Joachim Horsley, who is a composer and pianist. What you're listening to now is the overture, African Partita, from his new album Afro Bach, which takes Bach tunes and adds something. And I'll be talking to him about what it adds and why. But he's also a television composer, so there's a lot of classical contemporary music going on here, which is really, really interesting. So I'm very much looking forward to chatting with Joachim. Hey, Joachim Horsley, welcome to Harmonious World.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to talk to you. And I love it when PR people come up with something and they go, do you know what? I think this person will be a really good fit. And I was like, I'm always a bit like, oh yeah, all right, everyone says that. But then I looked at all your stuff and I was like, absolutely spot on.
Wonderful. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad. Well, I mean, it sounds like you guys like to see the world from lots of different points of view. So I'm glad to be part of it.
Well, and that's literally exactly what you're doing. This album, Afro Bach, is really interesting because you take Bach, which is, I'm sorry, but he's ours because he's European, and then you go, okay, well, then I'm going to introduce some African and some Caribbean sounds. And so what on earth inspired you to do that?
Well, so I work mostly as a film composer in Hollywood, and in 2015, I had the opportunity to study music in Cuba. I had studied Latin, played Latin music my whole life, but going there in 2015 really, that was an absolute game changer moment for me because I really, for the first time, got to see all the masterful rumba music and timba music that was coming out of Cuba. And not only did I learn details about the styles that I've been playing all my life as an American, but I also learned something about the energy and the passion that is really hard to know about until you go there. And so I'd always wanted to do a fusion project of classical music and Caribbean music. But what really got me excited was not just doing a new rhythm with Beethoven, but just the actual feeling and energy of being on that island. So with my project, I play a little role-playing game. What if Beethoven, instead of living in Vienna, was living in Havana? What if Bach, instead of living in Bonn or wherever he was during that part of his life, what if he had a Caribbean life? And I think we know about that, let's say Bach, for example, that Baroque culture fed into so much of why he did things the way he did. If you take that lovely and amazing counterpoint that we all love in Bach and you change the rhythms just a little bit so it fits into a particular dance style from the Caribbean, does it still become Bach? Does it become something? Does it stay Bach? Does it become something different? That's the question I like to ask, and it's kind of the adventure I like to go on with the music. And moreover, I think this project has made me understand the composer deeper. And, just like all of us, when we're trying to learn Bach and Beethoven, we do takedowns, just like the old masters did with their predecessors. I have to learn the music in an intimate way that I haven't really before in order to successfully pull this off. And it's obviously there's 1,000 subjective decisions to be making, but the goal is always to capture the attitude of Bach and the attitude of the dance style. So, for example, with a piece on the Afro Bach album, we did a piece called Bach Cumbia. And cumbia is an amazing traditional rhythm from Colombia. It's sort of the pride of Colombia, and it's amazing. And it's you see it in pop music with Shakira, but you also see it in tons of traditional music. And so taking a fugue and putting it in a cumbia style requires a rhythmic adjustment. But it works perfectly because if you can imagine that Bach had access to dance styles and so forth. As long as the rhythm is still there, it still captures sort of that Baroque floweriness in the music when you do it right. So the goal is to really try to preserve the best of both worlds in this combination and make it feel all at once fresh. And that's what really excites me about doing this, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it definitely does that, because it definitely brings it to life and brings it into the 21st century, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the funny thing is, I'm bringing things that are centuries old in both styles and trying to make a modern thing, right?
Right.
But yeah. So of course, we're trying to make a modern record. But I think most importantly is I want people to feel like they're going on a journey and an adventure. And to me, this music is all very much alive. I know that we're dealing with dead people's music, but it's alive. And I think Bach is kind of like, he's in everything. I mean, he's as close as we can get to the center of music, because everything that he did, every composer afterwards had to know how to write like Bach. And every genre and every Caribbean musician at some point was studying Bach, so we all know it. And the piano montunos, those amazing piano parts we see in typical Cuban music, all those guys, they studied Bach in Havana, because that's how they learn the technique before they can get to that. So it's not too weird actually to be doing classical music with Caribbean rhythms. I mean, after all, Chucho Valdez and a lot of great masters have done their own version. I think what I'm doing is I'm trying to make it, thinking about it like I'd like to make a repertoire that people will want to play as an alternate or as part of, a program with the legit version. And a lot of people actually have reached out and downloaded the sheet music from my website, and amateur and professionals go ahead and play that. So that's really exciting. So I'm glad to see that's happening, and I'm going to continue to try to, build these crafty arrangements for that reason. I think that's just wonderful.
Yeah, well, it is. And I think, as you say, you're taking music from different parts of the world and different eras and just
Mm-hmm.
making it yours. And one of the things that I really like about this podcast is, none of us is really reinventing the wheel. We're all just taking bits from elsewhere and going, oh, well, I like that. And, the number of times people mention Bach, just as
Mm-hmm.
you can't talk to a sax player without them mentioning either John Coltrane or Charlie Parker, and
Right.
it's an homage to them. It's not stealing their stuff and doing it, doing something that's a disservice. It's kind of taking it into a different context.
Exactly. And I think taking music into a different context is kind of how we appreciate, just like, we love the sun after 3 days of rain. You have to have variety in there to really appreciate it in life. And what's kind of important to remember, I think, is that Beethoven and Bach, they did that with composers that came before them. They,
Yeah.
and of course, some of the arrangements, like, of course, Rachmaninoff with Paganini, that stuff becomes standard repertoire, his version, and that's played just as much, if not more often, than the original Paganini. So, arrangements are a part of our world, and I think composers have always shown their respect for their forefathers that way. And this is sort of my way of doing that. Not to compare myself to Rachmaninoff, of course, but I do think it's important to, do arrangements and pay tribute in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. At this point, I would like to play a clip from Tropical Prelude. I really love the start of this, but then I like the next phase of it, the sort of B section or whatever. And I really like it. So, where was your creative process coming from for this one?
Oh, well, I love this piece, and I worked with a really nice cellist, Sebastien Hertaud from France. And the idea was that, this G major prelude is probably the most famous cello piece there is. Of course, Yo-Yo Ma and many others have made beautiful work of it. And I think there's a meditative quality that is in the original, and that version of classical music is very, very important. And so again, I think the goal here was to not lose that, but have a little bit of a sway. And we used kind of a Brazilian and Cabo Verde rhythm. Cabo Verde is kind of an Afro-Portuguese culture. It's the islands halfway, but if you draw a line on the map between Rio in Brazil and Lisbon in Portugal, halfway you'll hit Cabo Verde. And of course, this historically was a pit stop during the slave trade. And eventually, of course, when slavery ended, you had an Afro-Portuguese culture that lives and thrives there. And great music comes out of these islands, like Morna and all sorts of other wonderful styles. But the cavaquinho, the small guitar that's from Brazil, sort of is the most popular instrument from Cabo Verde. And to me, I thought it was possible to preserve that meditative quality from Bach with a little bit of that island feel here. And so that's kind of what inspired me. And it just, again, a slight rhythm adjustment, but it works really well for me. And of course, it helps to have a wonderful cello player help me out.
Yeah, and that cello just is beautiful.
Yeah, thanks. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Where did you record all of this stuff? Because you've got people from all over the place, haven't you?
Yeah, it's really an international project. So I live in Los Angeles, and I've recorded musicians. Sometimes we work remotely on that particular piece. We did it on a remote line while Sebastian recorded in Paris. But often we record abroad, and sometimes I work with people remotely. After COVID, it was an interesting phenomenon. Half the world had remote setups, and then after COVID, I think everyone had a remote setup. So I record with musicians. Sometimes they record from an island, from England, France, Europe, and United States. And fortunately, we all have ways to work together. What I really appreciate about these kind of collaborations, especially when I've got my background, and a folkloric musician has a totally different perspective. And, it's not just that I learn the rhythms of these things, but they all have their own kind of feel and swing. And just like you could say, waltz played in Vienna has its own feel and swing, right? No one else plays like the Viennese.
Yeah.
No one else plays like the Cubans. No one else plays like the Colombians. They all have their own thing. So I'm kind of like this tourist with these rhythms, so I like to really make sure that I'm understanding exactly how to swing in each of these styles, and it's fascinating. That being said, I think what's interesting in music is when you have kind of somebody who comes from a different world and they're still them, they're just doing something a little bit different. It's like a great poet with a French accent speaking English. Of course, they're going to have a different perspective than a native born American, for example. And I think that's actually really interesting. And so that's what it's all about. That's the fusion approach gets you to something a little bit different. And as long as we're all focused on really understanding what we're working on, it always comes out like something fresh. So that's the really exciting thing to me, to do something really, really fresh with these wonderful old rhythms and wonderful old music from Europe.
Yeah, great stuff. Can you tell my audience a little bit about your background? How did you end up here? How did you end up in California writing stuff for TV and then doing projects like this?
Sure. So I grew up in the Boston area. I had a German mom who was passionate about classical music. We were the kind of household where the opera was on every Saturday, very loud, I might add. And so that's what was around me growing up with her. On the other hand, I was in the U.S. and I eventually started playing jazz in high school and discovering Caribbean music, and I just fell in love with it and made it my interest to explore it as much as possible. And eventually, I started working as a film composer after kind of working as a jingle house, having basically a day job in New York, writing commercials and things like that. But really, I started there just taking out the trash and running Pro Tools for voiceover artists. And the owner would let me at night write demos on at the time he was doing promos for like Movie of the Week on A&E, which was basically cable television original music. And that was great. And I started to win some demos and then started to do some short films for students at NYU and Columbia Film School in New York. And then eventually some of those films went to the Sundance Film Festival, and I went out to Sundance and started talking to other composers who all said, Los Angeles is really where you should be. So in 2009, my wife and I moved out here and we started a family. Actually, she was pregnant when we moved out and we had never looked back. And LA is a wonderful place because you really have tons and tons of creative people. I worked as an orchestrator for other composers, and that's kind of how I got to understand orchestration a little better and also understand the culture and manner of film composing. And, film composers have to be the kind of ultimate fakers. You have to know every style. It is not acceptable to not understand how Indian classical music works, for example. And you have to understand old film music, but you have to understand classical music and jazz and rock and Caribbean music for sure. It's sort of built in that when you do that, you're just really doing your best to understand things all over the world. But Caribbean music, it really is like a treasure hunt. You have all these different, we'll never have a phenomenon like the Caribbean again because of the mix of cultures, and someplace like Colombia where you have indigenous, European, and African ancestry. And so you have this incredible mix, and it's so fascinating how that came about. I love it. And discovering that music for me is really discovering great treasures. And also it helps you sort of think about music differently. The way Cuban music is orchestrated, everything fits together like clocks and like gears in a Swiss watch, I would say. So it's crucial to understand that. And I think studying Cuban music actually makes you a better orchestrator in any genre because you start to understand efficiency. The Cubans that is really what it's all about. That dance music that happened in Havana for centuries, it's so efficient, and the way it works, it's kind of over time evolved into kind of perfect orchestration, if you can say that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think for me, when you're working with an orchestra and you want to make things as simple and efficient as possible, but no simpler than that, right? So that to me is a huge benefit of studying all this music. So I guess at the end of the day, I really get excited about learning new things, and it makes me feel like I can keep my music fresh if I'm always kind of at the edge of my understanding. I think that's the best way to say it.
That's brilliant. And because I think that, when people talk about Bach, they talk about the fact that the composition was almost mathematical and yet so creative and musical. So he managed to combine all of that. And I think it sounds like that's what you've discovered in the Cuban arrangement style, which is that you take things from all over the place and you bring it in almost a mathematical way that ends up being really creative.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating about music is when you study music, they say learn the rules and then learn how to break the rules. Now, when you study counterpoint and fugal writing in Bach, when you really, really study it, you see that sometimes he writes himself into a corner and breaks his own rules to benefit. The music is, of course, highly logical, but I think that we often forget that he was an artist and he made a lot of subjective decisions. And then, of course, Beethoven and Mozart understood Bach and they did their own thing. And then like for example, in music, we have this rule: no parallel fifths. And if you're not a musician, that basically means that, something that sounds like old Gregorian chant kind of becomes a no-no when you're writing in, let's say, a high classical style that Mozart wrote in. Well, Beethoven, there's many examples of him breaking that rule, and I'm glad he did. And then, of course, Schubert and all those guys afterwards, they had to live with the specter of Beethoven. And so eventually all these guys break the rules for our own benefit. What's interesting also is you don't have to learn all the rules before you decide to break them, though you should just keep learning no matter what, right? So when I did Beethoven in Havana, to be honest, when I look back on it, there are a lot of, I think, quote unquote, errors in that arrangement, things I wouldn't do again, things I would change. But sometimes when you naively dive into things, there's a benefit, because you're kind of bringing, you don't know what's not allowed. So you're almost like breaking the rules to begin with. Now, obviously you have to be careful, because if you're making dance music, there are rules where if you break them, people aren't going to want to dance. But getting into that and the details of that is the fun part. And I think that at the end of the day, as long as you're always making an effort to understand things and push yourself as far as you can, I think that's when music stays exciting.
Yeah. Brilliant. That is fantastic. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, Joachim. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. And anytime you want to talk again, I'm here.
That's brilliant. Well, I'll hold you to that, because
Okay.
I'm sure the next time you come up with something that I go, oh, that looks really interesting, we'll definitely get you on. So thank you.
Yes, yes. Well, the new album that I'm working on, I think, is going to be called Superfusion, and that's going to be many rhythms and many different composers, kind of all at once. I a lot of times I worked on things as Afro Bach, so that's obviously Bach with a specific Afro style, but I kind of have a more understanding now of how certain styles can come together. And, we live in a world with everything mixed up. We have access to all these wonderful cultures and all this wonderful music. To me, it feels like the next step is to do multiple rhythms within one song, and multiple composers within one song. So I'm really excited about that. And not to mention lots of collaborations with wonderful artists I've met along the way.
That sounds absolutely wonderful. And I think it's really interesting. The more I speak to musicians from America, we all need to celebrate the diversity that makes the world such a great place, rather than trying to focus in on, people that look like us.
Oh, of course. Well, I think musicians, Quincy Jones said it best when he said, if musicians ran the world, racism would have ended a long time ago.
Yeah.
We know the value of diversity. I mean, a band with just 4 bass players doesn't work, right? So we know when we meet someone who has different skills or a different perspective on a different instrument and a different background, it's like water. We want it. And so, of course, I think it's very easy for musicians to understand how it takes all kinds.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to talk with you.
You as well, really. And have a wonderful week.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation with Joachim Horsley. What an interesting guy. And what you're listening to is another track from Afro Bach. This one is called Cuban Concerto. And it's interesting that we were talking there about the Cuban arrangements and how that all works. So thank you for joining me for Harmonious World. Please do rate, review, share this episode and others. There are 315 more for you to listen to. Loads of really amazing musicians that I've had the opportunity to speak to. And don't forget, you can also look at my Patreon site, and on the website there are also lots of reviews of albums and gigs. I haven't yet been to a live gig in 2026 because I wasn't very well, but there are a few coming up, so I'm looking forward to that. I hope you have a really good week, and thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.